gold symbol. Like that's fine. Like, oh, he's here from this institution.
His name is Paul.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
No.
I'm perfectly fine.
We'll just give it a couple minutes.
Yeah. No, I'm all right.
Good morning. How are you? So you guys can start whenever. I just started the live stream.
Okay.
I don't know what's usually customary. If somebody just stands behind here or they're able to walk around. Because for me, I'm usually the guy who walks around using my natural voice. Rather.
Yeah, since it's streaming, standing behind the mic is preferable so that anyone who is tuning in can, if you move away from the mic, they won't be able to hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There are room mics, but they're not
As
as
powerful.
powerful.
Oh. Good thing I asked. Ooh.
Me first. How are you? Good.
Good morning. It looks like a couple people are coming, but we'll go ahead and get started. And if folks need to join us a little late, that's absolutely fine. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Quigley, and I'm Director of Special Collections and Archives in the UNLV Libraries. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the library today to hear a talk from our current Edenton Fellow, Dr. Paul Khiatani. Following his talk, there will be time for questions and answers. We are live streaming this event, so please take this opportunity to silence your cell phones. In Special Collections and Archives, we preserve evidence of the history of Las Vegas and Southern Nevada and share the stories that make our region and our people unique. We collect the papers of individuals, the records of organizations, oral histories that capture the unwritten histories of people in our community, and much, much more. We preserve these collections so they can be used to support learning, teaching, and the creation of new knowledge within our community for generations to come. If you're interested in the work of Special Collections, please find us on social media or our blog, where we often post about our collections and all of the fun and illuminating items they contain. We also provide access to thousands of digitized items via our online portal. You can find links to all of this on our webpage at library.unlv.edu/SPECCOL. And we also have some cards at the end of your table with more information about the portal specifically, as well as a direct link to that resource. Awarded since 2007 and named for Dr. William R. Edenton, the Edenton Fellowship supports the use of the unique collections held in Special Collections and Archives to conduct scholarship on gaming or the history of Las Vegas. We're privileged to offer several 2- and 4-week fellowships each year that bring a wide array of scholars to our campus. Applications for the next round of fellowships are currently open. If our collections can further your research or scholarship, please take a look at that announcement that is available on our website and consider submitting a proposal. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Khiatani. He is a research assistant professor in the Department of Applied Social Sciences at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. He received his master's degree in applied sociology and PhD in sociology from the City University of Hong Kong. His research interests include social and political participation, such as volunteering, protests, and collective actions, youth studies and emerging adults, organized crime and street gangs, and deviant or counter-normative behaviors. His talk today focuses on his research into the life of Moe Dalitz and his influence on the growth of Las Vegas. Please welcome Dr. Paul Khiatani.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I'm going to slightly ignore the fact that it's being live streamed because I get very anxious about this. So I'm going to talk as if you are the only, you're the only people here in attendance. A good place to start would be to give some thanks. I would like to specifically thank Sarah Quigley and the team at the Special Collections and Archives. I know I'm really quite the quiet one whenever I'm working, but I do really appreciate your help. It has really helped me a lot, not just, assimilate and become accustomed to the way of life here, but also in terms of actually giving me the data and research material that I need to further my research. That is not to say that I've completed my research. No, far from it. This is a work in progress. Much like Las Vegas, the life of Moe Dalitz is quite complicated, and I may have underestimated this complexity when I thought that, a 2-week visit may be sufficient. But nonetheless, I would like to share with you some of my findings, some of my thoughts with regards to these. A good place to start as well, to get my mouth moving a little bit and to become a little bit accustomed to the thoughts that I'm using a speaker and hearing my own voice. I'd like to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, and that is, how is it someone from Hong Kong is coming here to talk about Las Vegas and talking about a very important individual, Moe Dalitz. Now, in the process of explaining this, it will give you a little bit of an insight into what the topic is about, what my presentation is about, as well as where I'm coming from. All right, so I did my studies in psychology and sociology. Psychology was in my undergraduate studies, and then sociology thereafter. During my undergraduate studies, I was very interested with gambling addiction research, right? So I came across a lot of the key figures, Alex Blazinski, and so on and so forth, when I traveled through conferences. What I think set me and my team apart from the rest was that we were interested in gambling pathway development among people that were marginalized. So in that, we did a lot of life history interviews with members of organized crime in Hong Kong, the Chinese triads. There was this one day when in one of the conference presentations I was giving, a gentleman stood up and he asked, well, that's interesting. You're approaching this from a life history course perspective, but why don't you look at the social forces in play? That is to say, why don't you take a sociological perspective to understanding gambling and what impact it has, what meaning it has for them, right? So that's kind of what tipped me then to study sociology. And when I was studying sociology in my master's degree, I was hard set on trying to make sense of this puzzle that I kept encountering. And the puzzle was, I'm not sure about most of you, but from what I've read, especially from development studies, they would say that organized crime is unfavorable to development. They are a bane to development, right? They cause more problems than provide solutions. But if that were true, then how is it possible that organized crime has existed for as long as it has? And it has spread out as far as it has. You look at Asia, you look at Europe, you look at North America. Every corner, you can find one way or the other, organized crime, gangs, mobs, what have you, right? If they were so bad, and if they were such a bane to society and development, then they should have been eradicated. They should have been rooted out. But in the city that I was living in, it was quite clear that the triads were there, for example. And they were providing a functional, they had functional use, right? Even in the history of Hong Kong. So then that's where I kind of flipped the script a little bit and tried to see the extent to which perhaps the underworld, broadly speaking, yes, to cover these different entities, could actually be used to help development, right? They may have powers, they may have resources that are illegitimate, but they could be leveraged one way or the other. Yes? So that's where I then decided to study Las Vegas and Macau, at least. And these two books were very important for me in developing my thought, right? The first one, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, especially if you adopt a critical perspective to understanding American life and so on. The second one, perhaps not so familiar, but if you are in sociology, you would have perhaps read Gang Leader for a Day. Now, in the first book, I will talk about it a little bit more. We understand that, well, decision-making and the development of society doesn't really rest with us ordinary folk, but perhaps it is concentrated in the hands of a select few, those in the inner circle. Yes? The second book talks more on the relationship between the underworld and the upperworld, not just in terms of development, but in terms of how it creates regularities in our way of life. Yes, in terms of exchanges, in terms of services, and so on and so forth. Now, for me then, I try to think about it this way, that if the upper world and the underworld did interact with one another, how did the power elite necessarily perceive them? And how can we make sense of this in terms of development? So just some background about the power elite in case any of you may need a refresher. Yes, that real power, as argued by C. Y. Mills in 1956, is concentrated in the hands of a select group of people. He categorized three groups primarily: the corporate elite or business elite, political elite, and the military elite. Yes, they do not operate independently, rather they intersect with one another through interactions in various platforms. Yes, these groups are not independent from one another, they are interdependent, blurring the lines between their respective domains by virtue of shared similar backgrounds, for example, going to the same school, being part of the same club, and so on and so forth. Right? And his argument is that it is through these various interfaces or these interlocking directorates that they then make decisions for the rest of the nation. And these nations may not be purely altruistic, rather they can be self-serving. Yes? And then what it means then for the ordinary citizen, according to C. Y. Mills, is that they have decreasing influence on decisions or decision-making of importance. Yes, so we emphasize the idea that they interact with one another, they have shared backgrounds, but he also emphasized the importance of relationships in influencing decisions. Now, these are some quite important points that I will draw upon later in this presentation. That is to say that relationships, your past relationships can always be drawn upon in present circumstances, right? And you can use this for present endeavors. So, C. Y. Mills paved the way for a more critical perspective. The common criticism that I've read about is overstating the unity and coherence of the elite. And this is, well, part of the problem about this is the idea about the quality of data available, right? It's not like there are transcripts available for every meeting they would have had behind closed doors. So, yes. But for me, the question was about the reality of the underworld and upperworld interaction between each other, right? And what implications then this has for it, points that matter, and that for me was about development. For me, what I thought was that if the power elite was solely constrained to those in the upper world, yes, the upper world being that is contrasting mobs, organized crime, gangsters, and so on the underworld, then their power would actually be quite limited because they're limited by laws, limited by policy, and so on. That is to say that they only have access to legitimate power. There is another side to that coin, and that is illegitimate power. Right? So during my master's degree research, I created the, well, concept of state crime elite. That is economic elites that strategically use relations with both elites of the upperworld and underworld to pursue their interests. In this case, I was looking at development of Las Vegas between the 40s and 80s through Moe Dalitz, and then I was also looking at Dr. Stanley Ho Hong Sun for Macau between 1960s and 2000s. But in this presentation, I'll only focus, of course, on Moe Dalitz. Now, the question that I had 10 years ago still remains till today. How is it that Moe Dalitz used his networks and relationships on both sides to shape Las Vegas? Yes, I use a lot of these black screens to indicate to myself that, oh, now it's a transition. We're transitioning to somewhere else. So it doesn't mean it's the end of the presentation or there's like a technical issue. Okay, so Morris Barney Dalitz, or Moe Dalitz. But I'm always going to put Morris Barney Dalitz because that's what I constantly read from the FBI files, besides his other aliases and pseudonyms. Moe Davis, William Davis, and so on and so forth. Okay, so he was born 1899. He married Dorothy and then divorced, married Avril, and that's then where he had daughter Suzanne. Okay, he was born in Boston, moved to Michigan during his formative years. He went high school there, went to Michigan. He was brought up in the laundry business and linen supply business, following after his father. Then he went to Cleveland, Ohio. Between the 1920s and 1930s, that's also when he started to get in touch a little bit with the mobsters. Yes? And then he moved to New York and Cleveland, and then just happens before Las Vegas. Yes? So during the Prohibition era, which was what, 1920 to 33, 32, 1920, about something like that. Yes, he got involved in the illegal liquor business, and that's also where he met a lot of his networks that really stayed with him until his time in Las Vegas and when he started to build his empire here. Yes, and then in 40, even when he enlisted in the services, he still maintained his business contacts, and they were operating the businesses even while he was away. And then returned. Yes, he was specifically involved in the bootleg whiskey business, transporting some whiskey from Canada to the US because people were willing to drink. And insofar as people were willing to drink, he was happy to supply. He became then the Mayfield road gang leader, which comprised of Dalitz and 14 other known hoodlums. They had powerful connections already by the 1930s. And this, I believe, has a lot to do with the fact that they were supplying very powerful and important people with the liquor. Of course, during this period also, he became a little bit involved with gambling as well as other forms of rackets. So specifically, if you read the files, that is the FBI declassified files of 2,729 pages, you would realize that he had a large interest in the Ohioville, as well as the Thomas Club, as well as various other swank clubs, illegal gambling parlors, and so on. I show up a visual aid later to depict all of this. And they were, of course, frequented by not just members of his own gang, but also members of other gangs and people generally, both from the upper world as well as underworld. Insofar as they were willing to gamble, insofar as they were willing to accept his services, his liquor, and so on and so forth, he was in the right space to interact with them. And Moe Dalitz was not an introverted individual by any stretch of the imagination. No, he knew how to carry himself. So some points to note about Moe before he appeared in the Las Vegas scene, and that is he had extensive upperworld, underworld connections already by the 1930s. By the 1920s, he was already affiliated with Jimmy Hoffa, and then during the 30s, he was affiliated with some of the local politicians, indirectly as well as directly. It is considered that he is a shrewd and careful leader who has connections in New York, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, as well as other cities already during the 30s. Specifically, he also had associates that had even stronger connections, and that's where I mean that he had indirect influence and indirect connections. Yes, so for example, Maurice Maschke and E.D.P. Strong, and so on. During this time, it was quite obvious as well that his connections were helping him. That is, for example, I can't stay away from the mic. That, according to some of the reports coming out of the Cleveland office, that notwithstanding the fact that several local county grand jury investigations were conducted, they did not have any definitive action thereafter, and they were either dropped or dismissed. And this, at least the memo stated that it believed that the officials conducting these investigations were influenced to discontinue or drop investigations due to powerful connections of Moe Davis and his associates, which they're known to have in this area. Now, this was already, again, during the 1930s. I need to emphasize this point, because that is to say that when he came to Las Vegas, he wasn't necessarily starting a new leaf over, cutting all his previous connections. No, these things carry through. And it's important to realize this. So what at least during his early years, what we know is that he had an ice cream company, as well as he was involved in the linen supply company. But from the FBI declassified documents, we understand that that was actually the headquarters of Moe Davis and the Liberty Ice Cream Co., which, it doubled as a front, as a cover-up organization for large-scale bootlegging operations and rackets. So that is to say that Moe Dalitz is familiar with operating behind the scenes. Yes, having frontmen, having front cover businesses, and so on and so forth. So based on the 1939 memo that profiled Moe Dalitz as well as his associates, as well as the companies and so on and so forth, moving forward, I created this visual aid because I think it's about some time to take a break from some of the texts that have been shown up there. Some of these names may seem a little bit familiar to you, yes, like Morris Kleinman, Lou Rothkopf. Oh, by the way, if I happen to mispronounce people's names, please forgive me. Thank you. Maurice Maschke, Al Polizzi, and so on. Some of these names may be familiar to you because even when he came to the Las Vegas scene, he brought them with him. Yes? At the same time, you may realize, well, there are certain names that are missing, right? Like, where's Mr. Tucker? Right? Where's Thomas McGinty? Where's Ruby? For some reason or another, I believe their names were redacted. So that's why you have person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, going all the way to 13. And I'm not sure exactly why it was redacted during that period of time, but I believe it is reflected here. Yes? Now you may notice that in some of the, let's say, names just above it, there's like a pin on it. And the pin kind of reflects the idea that they have strong relations with elites in the upper world, right? Because I'm not only trying to show that, well, these were his underground crew, his underworld crew. No, I'm also trying to showcase the idea that there was a relationship and an interaction that was happening through networks. Yes, a lot of these companies operated in Cleveland, Ohio, except for the, let me see, Frolics Club. Yeah, that one would have been Miami, Florida. Yeah. Yes, so in 1941, as law enforcement got a little bit thick, then he started to move a little and diversify a little bit more, notably with the Beverly Hill Country Club. Now, the Beverly Hill Country Club, I've never been there, yes, but I find it quite interesting that during the oral history transcript that Moe Dalitz gave, he only, of all the questions, he refused to answer 2. And one of them was about his prior holdings. The interviewer asked him, oh, I believe you had some establishments in Cleveland as well as in Kentucky. And he said, yes, I do have about 2 or 3. Then the interviewer asked, can you name them? And he said, do I really need to? Well, I'm not going to name them, but I will tell you that I owned the Beverly Hill Country Club, and it was poppin'. I mean, he didn't use those words exactly, but it was very popular, right? And I think it's important to emphasize this point again, because Moe Dalitz is a very complicated man, and this presentation will not be, the be-all, end-all. for his life. But I believe that there are certain insights we can get, even from that transcript itself, right? That when I was drafting this, I was thinking to myself, okay, the reason he may have said, okay, so the other two that he failed to mention during the transcript was the Ohio Villa as well as the Thomas Club. Now, the Ohio Villa and the Thomas Club were both notorious illegal establishments or shady establishments. But the Beverly Hill Country Club was one where you had a lot of powerful people also frequented. And I think then this perhaps explains why he was happy to mention this name, but refused to mention the other two. And this again then reflects the idea that he's trying to come out of the shadows of the underworld. And that is perhaps one prominent theme that you realize as he moves to Las Vegas. That a lot of the times he's actually hiding in the shadows or he's in the background a lot. But over time, during the late 60s, 70s, 80s, he's more willing and more happy to come out. Yeah. He also had various interests, race drug tracks, and so on and so forth. Some were successful, some were not, because it was illegal at the time. And then shortly after he got divorced, he enlisted for the US Army. There he was assigned to the laundry concession, and he did a very good job. I went to the Mob Museum, I saw his letter, glowing letter of praise, and his medal I read in the oral history. And I think, yeah, he really did do his best there. But that why I bring this up is to also say that even when he enlisted in the military and he was gone for that period of time, roughly 3 years, 2.5, not 3 years, let's say, he still maintained strong contacts with his business associates, with Morris Kleinman, Sam Tucker, and so on and so forth, who were still running businesses in Cleveland, Kentucky, Miami, and so on. So he was not completely out of the game. He wasn't trying to turn over a new leaf. So when he returned, yeah, so you can see that, yes, Kleinman was his right-hand man who was very involved in the business operations while he was away. And so when he returned, he assumed, again, the position of the leader to help out with these operations as well as further development and further planning. Now, the networks got a little bit too jumbly that I began to think, well, the audience members may not appreciate lines going here, there, crisscross, applesauce, everywhere. So I decided, okay, let me just try to condense things a little bit more. So during the 40s, they had strong foothold in Ohio, of course, then Kentucky, Florida, and then furthermore. So they also had in California. They were talking some things about in Havana, Cuba, and so on and so forth. Yes? And again, you will notice that some of these names were carried through from the 1930s, and some of the names I just put there because they were no longer redacted. For some reason, Thomas McGinty, Roby Collode, and so on, Cornelius Jones, their names were no longer redacted. So I said, okay, I can freely put it up there then. Next section. Okay, so now they enter the Las Vegas scene, 1950s. Now, during that period of time, as many of you may know, he helped Wilbur Clark build the Desert Inn, helped finance it, right? It was able to open its doors to a roaring and wonderful opening ceremony. Yes? By many accounts, at least from the FBI files and magazines and newspapers thereafter, they mentioned that, well, although Wilbur Clark was the face of the Desert Inn, he had very little voice actually in the decision-making and so on. Now, I wasn't there, but what I can tell you is that from the FBI declassified files, it seems to be that case, because there are transcripts as well, especially during 1962, 1959, and so on, very detailed transcripts, because during that time, they already did wiretapping in the Desert Inn. And in those transcripts, they even mention about how Wilbur Clark doesn't really have a say in this or that, and so on and so forth. But they acknowledged his function as being one of the best promoters that we could ever ask for, and so on. As part of the exchange, Wilbur Clark sold 75% of his interest to to a group of Midwestern investors, headed by laundry operator Moe Dalitz. Now, this is just some of the ways in which Moe Dalitz and his associates were portrayed. I realized that when I was reading a lot of the periodicals, newspapers, magazines that were available in the special collections and archives, I realized that there were very different ways in which they portrayed Dalitz and his group. They called them Midwestern investors, businessmen, a group from Cleveland, and so on and so forth. It was quite obvious that it was sensitive to mention that they were from the mob or they had shady ties and so on. And it would not look good, certainly. And together they formed a great, great team that helped Desert Inn develop to become what it became. I was very happy to read the Wilbur Clark and Tony Clark collection, because in there was one folder that mentioned all the glowing letters from foreign dignitaries and leaders, from military elites to political elites to local industrial elites, all saying how they had a marvelous time in the Desert Inn. And this, for me, kind of showed me how important this hotel was, not just for Las Vegas, but for the country as well, that it was world-renowned. You have people from the foreign dignitaries from Pakistan, from Netherlands, from the UK, all coming. Yes, yeah, so as I mentioned, yeah. Thereafter, of course, Moe Dalitz also diversified a little bit to also take over the Stardust Hotel later on. And thereafter also he diversified a little bit more, right, with purchasing other casinos, but at the same time making a mark in community development with the Sunrise Hospital and other community developments that he was involved with. Yeah. And for this, he was well recognized for receiving various accolades, right? And yes, I'm saying all this to say that it was well deserved. Yes, I'm not kind of giving this presentation to say in any way that, in any way to throw a mark at his legacy. No, that is not my interest. My interest is in kind of reconceptualizing how we think about him, right? And after reconceptualizing that, thinking about if this type of prototype individual exists in other countries as well. Next section. Yes, so specifically, I would like to focus on 1962. Now, I want to focus specifically on 1962 for a couple of reasons, right? First reason is that Dalitz was becoming increasingly a powerful player in the Strip. He was becoming very well known. He became the president of the Nevada Hotel Association. He bought Stardust, he had Desert Inn, and so on and so forth, right? And at that time also, Wilbur Clark was thinking about, actually selling off his interest to Dalitz and the group. But also when I was reading the FBI files, what became apparent to me was that during this period of time, Moe Dalitz was actually thinking about retiring. He was actually thinking about leaving it all because the heat was becoming a little bit too much for him. He was under investigation. He knew that he was being investigated by the FBI, by the IRS, and they were being unrelenting on this. So in the transcripts, you could see that he made a lot of travels to London, to Norway, to buy a yacht, right? And talking about how he would like to spend some of his days in the Mediterranean Sea, so that, we're just waiting until things cool down a little bit. And during this time also, there was an important election that was coming up, the 1962 gubernatorial elections, right? So there are various reasons why I would like to focus on this, and the FBI declassified files has extensive transcripts and documents about this, because during that period of time, they already had an informant in Dalitz's inner circle, right? So a lot of the transcripts were coming from literally the closed doors, behind the closed doors. And they also had wiretapping at that time installed. So yeah, microphone installation was made in the executive office of the Desert Inn. Initially, it was set for from August 61 to March 62, but then it got extended because of the quality and value of the information that was coming through. Even then, with all his accomplishments in community development and the development of the casino city itself, by accounts of the FBI, they still held him to be a national hoodlum figure, and he was being the head of the group that operates the Desert Inn or Stardust hotels. In the FBI files, they call him Moe Dalitz and the Desert Inn Group. They call it like that. And why they were involved, why they were investing so much into this was because they were looking at skimming operations as well as undisclosed interests in the Nevada gambling industry. As well as, they were looking for information about how influential Moe Dalitz and his group were in the political activities, local as well as national. Next section. Yes. So now to talk a little bit about the inner circle. So in this section, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show how Moe Dalitz and his group had very strong influence over 3 groups. And that is first, the political elites, second, industrial or casino owners, right? And third, the underworld still. And a lot of this power came from the but rather the running ongoing operation of skimming off the top. Yes? Those in the inner circle were Sam Tucker, George Gordon, Ruby Collode, and Morris Kleinman. Of course, the FBI doesn't necessarily say that they're in the inner circle, but when you go through hundreds of pages of the verbatim transcripts, you realize that, yes, their name comes up very often. So, according to the informant, right, that skimming, first I'll talk about skimming operations because this is very important. Yes. The proceeds from that skimming operation, they were able to then use it for example, giving loans, as well as financing campaigns, political campaigns. As well, on the other hand, they were able to give it then to their underworld friends or peers if they needed it, which I'll show you later. Now, in terms of the skimming operation, it happened before the actual formal counting process. Yes, they had sheets of papers, and they would begin to count the money and begin to divvy up the amounts allocated to different people. Importantly, the 2 individuals in the room then ended up with various columns of figures and apparently wrote additional figures down and then checked these figures back and forth with each other. Here it is important to realize that, as I will show later, that although there was a very clear owner of record, let's say, for the Desert Inn and Stardust, that was just the paper and pencil distribution. The real distribution did not go through that. The real distribution went through another set of sheets, one for the Desert Inn and one for Stardust, which had very different point distributions for individuals. And what they were doing was to try and calculate how much each person gets, especially if they had points in Desert Inn and then they had points in Stardust. Yeah. So since this activity occurred outside the regular counting room and behind a closed locked door, it probably represented money taken off the top and distributed without accounting for the money for tax purposes. Yeah. So October 1962, it was apparent that a month money which has been taken off the top is distributed among various owners of record and those who have interest. That means undisclosed interest. Sums in excess of 100,000 were distributed monthly. Yes? Dalitz received in excess of 10,000 from each cut meaning Desert Inn as well as Stardust. Money was also designated to sources in Chicago during these distributions. Here, if you're familiar with Moe Dalitz's friends during the 1960s, you know that he was affiliated indirectly with the Chicago outfit. I believe at that time the leader then was Sanjiankana, if I'm pronouncing his name proper. And Sanjiankana did have a representative in Desert Inn to make sure that the Chicago's interests were properly taken care of. Other individuals also paid from this pool before the regular distribution were made, included entertainers who are in high income brackets so that they don't get taxed a lot, as well as payments to public officials. Now for context, just to put into context what 100,000 is. Desert Inn was leasing Stardust for 100,000, at least during that period of time as per the record. So that's a lot of money. Now, importantly, the informant mentioned that it is noted that there is no relationship between points which are actually on the record and the points which are owned by partners and other individuals connected with the Desert Inn. It appears that these points are passed around indiscriminately without making necessary changes on the license as required by state law. I must have read this passage 4 or 5 times across various reports because this is something the informant kept bringing up. Yes, the idea that this skimming operation was very important to Moe Dalitz's and his Desert Inn group's overall operation. Yes, it was really a massive operation that they had, that they were collecting every month from both Desert Inn as well as Stardust. And of course, as Desert Inn and Stardust grew in popularity, started to make more money, that amount which was able to be skimmed from the top grew. Yeah. So first, for example, it was skimmed off the top to pay under the table to high net worth entertainers. For example, the memo mentions about Jack Benny, who was probably paid under the table since he just completed an engagement in Desert Inn. And the informant previously reported that it is a practice to pay well-known entertainers who are of high income brackets and such. As well as outside parties, notably, I would suggest associates from the underworld, for example, with the Chicago outfit. That when an individual from Detroit came to Dalitz and asked for $2,000 to build a Catholic church, well, according to more information, the informant noted that this individual was a nationally known Detroit hoodlum, right? That Dalitz initially shrugged him off, saying that, well, it's hard to get that much amount of money. The amount of money you're asking for is really a lot. But, I could pay something still. Yeah. And then, of course, the memo also mentions other parts in which, although a lot of the names are redacted, they mention Chicago outfit, they mention Sanjiankana, and so on, in association with skimming operations, amount of money, and so on and so forth. Third, under the table to public officials. Now, this one is heavily redacted and unintelligible. If I showed you the actual transcript, you would say, Paul, how are you going to read this? There's no way to read this, right? So this is just a small snippet to then, transition to a much larger section I have that talks about the public officials and politicians. So now, the informant did a really good job, I think, in my opinion, for the amount of time and the risk that that person was taking upon themselves. That they were able to also account for how much value was assigned to per point. And at that period of time, it was about 15 to 18,000 per point. Yes? So employees at the hotel who are stockholders receive an addition to the remuneration. And this, of course, was off the top, so it was not going to be taxed. Yeah. So this over a year approximated to 1.8 million taken illegally from each hotel, that is Desert Inn as well as Stardust. And this, of course, went to members in the inner circle as well as pit bosses and so on. Yeah. So here I'm just trying to emphasize the point that the money that was skimmed from the top, apart from paying these 3 groups, those notable partners, high net worth entertainers and politicians. The remaining money was then distributed among those in the shadow sheets, let's say, right? Where even the original pit bosses of Stardust were given a point each, and none of these individuals were owners of record. The informant was, well, a lot of the names were redacted, but the informant was able to deduce that a lot of the money that was coming out of these skimming operations went to those that were not even licensed, that were not on record, right? And some of these individuals had representatives that were owners of record. So for example, George Gordon. George Gordon was not an owner of record, but the informant deduced that he was being represented by Ruby Kolode, who was an owner of record. Yeah, so points which generally correspond to percentages are distributed indiscriminately at the Desert Inn and Stardust hotels without regards to actual point distribution on the record, and as it has been approved by local gaming authorities. Yes, and this distribution to various individuals, both within and without the organization. So for example, the Chicago outfit, as I mentioned earlier. So here is an example of the owners of record. Yes, for the Stardust in 1958. Well, at least from what I can deduce from 1962 files, the percentage was not this way. It was the distribution by the point system that they had was very different. But this is what is on record. This information stands in contrast to some of the information that I collected from the special collections and archives, in which he said that, well, we follow the rules and regulations that were laid down by the gaming control people, and we were not kind of involved with skimming operations and so on. Now, again, I do not hold this against him. In fact, I expected him to say such, because during that period of time, he was still reforming his image. He was still coming out as being, legitimate, and he wanted people to really take him that way, right? So I'm not surprised that he said this, but the idea that, the materials and texts that I collected in the collection stand in contrast to it, I think for me tells a lot about the type of predicament he was in, or the type of dilemmas he was facing. Yeah. Importantly, this insider point system is actually quite fluid in contrast to, let's say, the owners of the legitimate record, right? Whereby in 1962, as I mentioned earlier, Moe Dalitz was really thinking about retiring. He talked about it at length, at least on 3 or 4 separate days. He had mentioned this because there was somebody coming up with a book about him, and he was saying, well, all of that is not true. I'm legitimate. I've done a lot for Las Vegas and so on. Now, of course, the book he's talking about is Greenfeld Jungle, which came out in 1963. But if you read the files, you realize that it had a real toll on him, that he was very anxious about this. And he couldn't really understand why people were still going after him during that period of time. So they thought about to bring in somebody with a legal background to come in, right? And a lot of the discussions they had during September and October was to try and figure out how are we going to reallocate these points so as to make room for him to come in. And initially they had decided that he would get 3 points in Desert Inn, 2 in Stardust, of course, excluding the fact that he would get salary and he would get a lot of benefits in terms of staying in the Desert Inn for a very cheap price. Now, talking about political activities, it is quite obvious that from July all the way to November, that this was a constant topic of discussion in their meetings, that they were very active in discussing about political activities, identifying the right candidates, trying to gather people together to support them, discussing how much money to give, and so on and so forth. Yeah, they also discussed about other things. For example, federal grand jury hearings and discussing about how they can be, 10 minutes, nice. Okay, how can they be settled and so on and so forth. Yes. Specifically for political activities and campaign financing, they did it in two ways. First, as a group, Desert Inn Group, Stardust Group, and second, through Nevada Hotel Association. Now, it's quite interesting, and I talked quite a lot with Soo Kim about the Nevada Hotel Association and really thank her for her help on this. I was trying to figure out what power do they really hold, right? What exactly are they? Well, they are quite successful in their political action, and they are a group of casino owners from the different casinos, right? And in 1962, Moe Dalitz was the president of that association, and he used that association to, first of all, get everyone on board, as I'll mention later, as well as to then suggest to the politician that's running that we are backing you, we are supporting you as a group, casino owners. Yeah. But at the same time, Dalitz and his associates gave additional contributions to some of these candidates under the name the Desert Inn Group or through skimming operations, through that distribution system. Here, it is quite obvious that their efforts, yielded good fruit. That in November, they mentioned that, we're being stronger, our influence has been stronger than ever before, as well as the informant's summary that it is noted that with very few minor exceptions, candidates supported financially by Desert Inn and the gambling industry, here meaning the Nevada Hotel Association, were retained or elected office on November 6th. At the same time, because he had connections to the underworld, he was able to also draw from the finances in the underworld, right? And some of his relationships with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters helped with that financing. If a casino owner needed financing, they would come to Moe Dalitz. It was not just politicians that would come to him. Other business elites would also come to him. And here, I would like to emphasize a little bit about the point about him being president of the Nevada Hotel Association. That he was able to strong arm the other casino owners to come on the same boat and support a specific politician. Here suggesting that, well, two hotels are kind of running their own thing, and he doesn't like that. So he suggested, why don't we form a local show reservation? Show reservations would be honored for only member hotels, and this would cause the Sahara and the Dunes considerable hardship. Therefore, if they want to be part of it, they have to join this association. And when they're part of the association, they have to follow suit. That Moe Dalitz says, we're going to support this person as the Nevada Hotel Association. We all have to do that. Yeah. And even then, it was not just from the informant's point of view or from the Las Vegas office point of view, but also from members in general, that they mentioned that Moe Dalitz did have a lot of power, even during the 60s. Like, when he spoke, things tended to happen. Okay, next section. Concluding remarks, yes. So I'm doing actually pretty well for time, I guess. Yes. Moe Dalitz was a complicated man. Again, as I mentioned, I did not realize how complicated things could be when I pair up both the FBI files and the historical depth about what was happening between the 50s and 80s. Combining them two together makes for a considerable feat and an effort. But at the same time, it is notable that Moe Dalitz, no matter what he did, how he drew his powers, how he drew his resources, how he mobilized them, he did considerable good for the city in terms of its overall development. And for that, rightly so, he is honored as being one of the 100 most influential persons to help Las Vegas become what it did, and so on and so forth. Yes, but here I think it's also important to emphasize that he was, even in their accounts, right, from newspapers, from these books and so on, that he was very complicated. He was a man with two different worlds, came from three different shadows, something like this, right? It was never very clear cut that he was a businessman. No, it was always that he was somewhere in sunshine as well as shadow and so on and so forth. So in the way that I conceptualize it, then it's, well, I tried my best. That, yes, I separate the underworld from the upper world, not to say that they can't be connections between the two, right? The Moe Dalitz and his inner circle, through their skimming operations, were able to help the mob outfits or mob associates if they needed money, for example. At the same time, Moe Dalitz and the inner circle served as an interface between the mob and political elites, for example, with regards to campaign financing or something of that nature. Moe Dalitz and his inner circle as well served as an interface between the political elites and casino elites in terms of passing favorable policies, not being too harsh on regulations and so on. And at the same time, through the Nevada Hotel Association, Moe Dalitz and his inner circle were able to serve as an interface of the influence between casino elites to the political elites, for example, through campaign financing and so on. And finally, because during that period of time, it was very difficult to get, to borrow money, to get loans from official financial institutions. And so casino elites were going to Moe Dalitz or going to some of his, or knew about his indirect associations and got financing through that way. Yeah. So Moe Dalitz then leveraged his connections to both underworld as well as upperworld to achieve desired outcomes, which was to enrich those with him, to promote the casino city development, as well as to reform his image and legacy. Yeah. A good way, I think, to close this would be to acknowledge that, well, relationships are very important to account for, right? Again, it's not that just because you come to a new city, you wear a new suit, you have new mannerisms, you have a new team around you, that your past relationships don't carry forward with you. And you're not able to tap them back if you need to, or tug them. Everybody has a backstory. And here, I hope that in discussing about Moe Dalitz in perhaps a way that is not commonly talked about, that you'll be able to better appreciate the man for who he was. Yes. So Las Vegas became the resting place for him in photos. Yeah. And then the references. Yes. Now this is the true black screen to show that is the end. Thank you very much. Oh, 3 minutes.
One or two? Is this better? Yeah. One or two questions for Paul?
Hi, Paul.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for your talk. That was super interesting. My question is how you're defining development. Like,
Sure.
what are you talking about here? Is it like economic development, like development of the built environment, social development, like social progress, like things like desegregation? And is this definition something that you are going to use for multiple case studies, or is it something that just applies to this like instance of Las Vegas at this particular time?
Great. I am talking about it in a multi-dimensional fashion. So yes, economically, the built environment, and so on and so forth. And yes, I am taking it forward and looking it, I mean, using that conceptualization with other case studies as well, notably Macau. Yeah, so definitely yes. Yeah.
Moe Dalitz comes in a unique historical period where we in Las Vegas went from the mob and the to the corporate gaming era.
Mhm.
And how did his influence or lack thereof influence that change from into the corporate gaming era?
I see. of course, I can't give you the like perfect answer. I'll only speak about what I know. So during that period of time, what was also quite obvious during the 1962 transcripts was that he did not want other outfits to come into Las Vegas. He was quite protective of it. He wanted it to be. He came from a mob background, but that doesn't mean that he wanted other mob figures to come in, and he was quite protective of it. I remember there was another transcript in 1959 or 1957 in which he mentioned that there were these figures from Detroit and New York that were coming in and visiting. And he explicitly told them, do not come here in again. Don't even bother trying to apply for a license, right? And even in his agreement with the Chicago outfit, he mentioned that we will have our operations here. You don't need to come here. Yeah. So I think this paved the way, at least in one way or the other, then for corporates to come in and for them to actually change the regulations, because they thought that at this time, about that time, well, things were getting cleaner. It was no longer a mob casino city. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, it is 11, so we need to end, but please stay if you have additional questions, and Paul, if you can hang out. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.